Welcome to week 3 of International Trade Economics. During this week, we will cover chapter 3, Labor Productivity and Comparative Advantage, or the Ricardian model. The developments of international trade theory have evolved over time. Studying these theories, we seek to answer two most important questions, which are what is the basis and gains from trade, and what is the pattern of trade. Let us start by a brief discussion of the developments to the theories of international trade before we analyze the theory of comparative advantage. The doctrine of mercantilism existed during the 17th and 18th century, where a group of men, that is merchants, bankers, government officials, and even philosophers, wrote essays and pamphlets on international trade. Their main idea was that for a nation to become richer and powerful, it had to export more than it imported. The excess surplus from the exports would then be settled by an inflow of bullion, which was gold and silver. Since not all nations can have surpluses at all the time, the amount of gold and silver was fixed at a particular point in time, implying that for a nation to gain from trade, that could be achieved at the expense of another nation. As a result, the doctrine came under scrutiny and writers start to oppose the ideology together with the role played by the government. One such writer was Adam Smith, who advocated for international trade through outlining the mutual benefits of voluntary trade between two nations based on absolute advantage. According to Adam Smith, if one country is efficient in the production of one commodity and less efficient than the other country in the production of another product, then there exist mutual benefits from trade between these two countries. That is, country A will specialize in the production of the good in which they have an absolute advantage and exchange the excess production with country B for the other product in which they have an absolute disadvantage. Although the theory of absolute advantage illustrated mutual benefits arising from the efficient use of labor, there was a serious dilemma it could not address, where one country was efficient in the production of both goods. In such a case, was there still mutual benefits to trade? This question was addressed by David Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, which is the focus of chapter 3. However, it should be noted that while the theory of comparative advantage is the cornerstone of international trade, it is a relatively simple model with many other missing important elements like factor abundance, economies of scale that are crucial in explaining the patterns of trade. After studying this chapter, you should be able to explain the Ricardian model, the most basic model of international trade, how it works, and how one can use it to illustrate the principles of comparative advantage. You should also be able to demonstrate gains from trade and refute common fallacies about international trade. You should also be able to describe the empirical evidence that wages reflect productivity and that trade patterns reflect relative productivity. Our discussion of the theory of comparative advantage will be structured as follows. Firstly, we will analyze opportunity cost and comparative advantage, followed by the discussion of the Ricardian model. Then thereafter, we'll focus on production possibilities as well as the role of relative demand and supply in determining relative prices. With these basics well understood, we will then be able to analyze gains from trade, effects of barriers to trade, as well as the empirical evidence of comparative advantage. Nations engage in international trade for several different reasons, where each reasons provide them with a specific benefit from trade. In the real world, the pattern of trade we observe reflect the interactions of countries based on the different benefit motives. The doctrine of mercantilism and the theory of absolute advantage we touched briefly on provide the foundation for us to start thinking and developing a simple model of comparative advantage. In this chapter, we will focus on the Ricardian model or the theory of comparative advantage, which is based on the differences in the productivity of labor as a result of differences in technology between the two nations. Then thereafter, in chapter 4 and 5, we will explore more explanatory variables that play a crucial role in international trade. These include physical capital, labor skills, and other factors of production. The concept of opportunity cost is a very important concept that applies to several economic decision-making processes. In production, the opportunity cost of producing a commodity is the value or cost of the second commodity that must be given up to release just enough resources to produce one additional unit of the first product. For example, suppose a limited number of workers could either produce roses or computers. If the workers spend all their time producing roses, then the opportunity cost of roses will be equal to the value or amount of computers not produced, and the reverse is true. An example will help clarify the concept of opportunity cost. Consider two goods, roses and computers, and two countries, United States of America and Colombia. Suppose in the US 10 million roses could be produced with the same resources as 100,000 computers, whilst in Colombia the same resources could either produce 10 million roses or 30,000 computers. Therefore, in the absence of complete specialization on either product, both countries can still produce both goods with fewer quantities, given that they have to free up some resources to produce an extra product of the other good. To determine the opportunity cost in either country, in the production of roses or computers, we have to evaluate what is being forgone to produce an extra unit of another good. That is, in US to produce 10 million roses, they have to forgo 100,000 computers, whilst in Colombia to produce 10 million roses, they have to forgo 30,000 computers. Therefore, Colombia has the lowest opportunity cost in the production of roses since they forgo fewer computers relative to the US in order to produce 10 million roses. On the other hand, for the US to produce one computer, they have to forgo the production of 100 roses, which is less than 333 roses that Colombia forgoes, implying that opportunity cost of producing computers is low in the United States of America. To determine comparative advantage, we compare the two countries' opportunity cost of production. A country has a comparative advantage in producing a good if the opportunity cost of producing that good is lower relative to the other country. Using our example, we can conclude that the United States has a comparative advantage in computer production and Colombia has a comparative advantage in the production of roses. Therefore, if both countries specialize in the production of the good in which they have the lowest opportunity cost or comparative advantage, then gains from trade will accrue to both nations as there will be more goods produced and consumed as compared to the pre-trade area situation. The table below outlines the outcome of specialization, which shows that have the United States stopped the production of roses and used its freed resources to produce computers, 100,000 computers will be produced. On the other hand, had Colombia stopped making computers and used the freed resources to produce 10 million roses would be produced. Therefore, With specialization and trade, both countries will still consume 10 million roses, but they now enjoy an additional total of 70,000 more computers. The outcome of the concept of comparative advantage reflects possible possibilities of mutual gains that can be attained with specialization and trade. Nevertheless, these benefits might not be achieved since international trade in goods and services is determined by the interaction or forces of demand and supply. Hence, an explicit trade analysis is required to determine the actual benefits, gains, and patterns of trade. The Ricardian model is one such tool that can help us in the analysis. The first thing in constructing the Ricardian model is to outline the assumptions of the model. The first assumption is that labor is the only factor of production. The second assumption is that labor productivity varies across country due to differences in technology, but labor productivity in each country is constant. Assumption number 3 is that the supply of labor in each country is also constant. Assumption number 4 is that we are only considering two goods, and for our sake we'll use wine and cheese, but you could use any type of goods. The analysis will be the same. Assumption number 5 is that competition allows workers to be paid a wage equal to the value of what they produce and allow them to work in the industry that pays the highest wage. In this case, there is no profit and workers are free to move within industries in search of a higher wage. The sixth assumption is that there is only two countries in this world, right? And for our sake, we are going to use home and foreign to represent the two countries. Based on the assumptions of the model, we further best describe the technology or production function of a country by the productivity of labor required in each industry, expressed in unit labor requirement. A unit labor requirement shows a specific number of hours of work or labor required to produce 1 unit of output. Please note that the productivity of labor in this way is being quoted inversely, meaning the more products a worker can produce, the lower the unit labor requirement. Thus, the home country for now and the two products will be used to start our modeling process. For us to start the modeling process, we have to define important elements of our model. ALC will represent the unit labor requirement for cheese in the home country. A subscript LW will represent the unit labor requirement of wine in the home country. Capital letter L will represent the total labor supply. Capital letter Q with the subscript C will represent the total cheese production. Capital letter Q with a subscript W will indicate the total gallons of wine that the home country produces. With all the economically active or total labor fully and efficiently employed in the production of both cheese and wine, there exists a limit to which these two products can be produced. That is, the maximum cheese production in the home country is equal to the total labor resources divided by the unit labor required, given that all resources are devoted to cheese production. The same is true for wine production. Therefore, any change from this limit implies a trade-off between the production of the two goods. These trade-offs are illustrated by the production possibility curve or frontier. The home country's PPC of cheese and wine is best described by an inequality, which just reflects that the total quantity of hours used to produce the total goods, both cheese and wine, should not exceed the total time that the economy has, or the total labor hours that the economy has, right? So this inequality just reflects that the hours worked or labor resources used in the production of all the cheese and wine should be less or equal to the total labor supply. Let us use a numeric example to help us plot our home country's PPC curve. Suppose the home country's total labor supply is 1,000 hours. More so, to produce a pound of cheese, 1 hour of work is required, whilst the production of a gallon of wine requires 2 hours of work. Therefore, our PPC curve inequality becomes QC plus 2QW should be less or equal to 1,000. The inequality is represented on a graph as shown in figure 3.1. Note the maximum cheese production on the x-axis is 1,000, whilst the maximum wine production on the y-axis is 500. Apart from producing only these extremes, the home country can produce a mix of both goods by foregoing some resources that could have been used in the production of the other good. The straight line PPC curve we saw in 3.1 reflects a constant opportunity cost, meaning the value or amount of resources we give up to produce one extra unit of another good remain the same as the production possibility curve along the production possibility curve, or as one moves along the production possibility curve. Constant opportunity cost arises when resources or factors of production are either perfect substitute for each other or are used in fixed proportions in the production process. They are not realistic, but they serve as an introduction to the case of increasing cost, which give rise to an outward bound PPC curve that we know. Recall the opportunity cost of cheese is equal to the gallon of wine that the home country has to give up in order to produce one extra unit of cheese. This is illustrated by the following symbol, which is a ratio of the unit labor requirement between the two countries. Thus, a constant unit labor requirement is required to produce a pound of cheese, of which this unit labor requirement could have been used to produce a gallon of wine. This opportunity cost is the same as the absolute value of the production possibility curve. Let us use a simple example to calculate opportunity cost. Suppose it takes 1 person-hour to make a pound of cheese and 2 hours to make a gallon of wine. Then by spending 1 hour in producing one extra unit of cheese, that 1 hour could have been used to produce half a gallon of wine. Thus the opportunity cost of producing 1 pound of cheese is half a gallon of wine. Understanding the concept and calculation of opportunity cost is one piece of a puzzle in building our model. However, to determine what each country will produce, we need to introduce prices. Prices enables us to find out what is the price of one good in terms of the other good, or the relative price of the economy's two products. Let PC denote the price of cheese whilst PW denote the price of wine. As a result of competition in the labor and goods market, supply decisions are influenced by individuals' attempts to maximize earnings. Note, there are no profits since workers receive the full value of their products. Hence, the supply of cheese or wine will depend on the sector that pays the highest wage. The hourly wage in the cheese sector, which we denote as WU with the subscript C, shows the earnings of cheese production in an hour, and the hourly wage in the wine sector, which is WU with the subscript W, illustrate the value of wine produced in an hour. Given the values of the wage rate in both the cheese and wine sector, workers will then make their decision to work or produce either of the goods. Recall, this decision is based on the sector that maximizes earnings. If the price of cheese relative to the price of wine exceed the opportunity cost of cheese, then the wage paid in the production of cheese will exceed those paid in wine production. Therefore, workers will work or choose to produce cheese only since it is maximizing their earnings. Thus, the economy will specialize in cheese production. Alternatively, if the price of cheese in terms of the price of wine is less than the opportunity cost of producing cheese, then the wages in the wine sector will be higher than the wages in the cheese sector. Then workers will choose to work or produce wine only. Thus, the economy will specialize in wine production. In the case that the relative price of cheese in terms of the price of wine equal to the opportunity cost, then the wage in both sectors will be the same. Hence, workers will be indifferent to work or produce cheese or wine. Thus, both cheese and wine will be produced in the economy. In conclusion, we can relate the relationship between prices and production as the economy will specialize in the production of cheese if the relative price of cheese exceeds its cost in terms of wine, or alternatively, the economy will specialize in wine production if the relative price of cheese is less than its opportunity cost in terms of wine. Let us use an example to reflect specialization as illustrated by the relationship between prices and production. Suppose cheese sells for $4 per pound and wine sells for $7 per gallon. The wages paid in the cheese sector will be equal to the value of cheese produced in an hour. On the other hand, the wages paid in the wine sector are equal to the value of wine produced in an hour. The wages for cheese will be equal to $4, whilst those for wine will be equal to $3.50. Therefore, in this example, workers will specialize in the production of cheese since the relative price of cheese in terms of the price of wine will exceed its opportunity cost. Using the same example, suppose firstly the price paid for the gallon of wine is $8, then the relative price of cheese in terms of wine will be the same as the opportunity cost. Thus, workers will work in both sectors and both cheese and wine will be produced. Secondly, if the price paid for a pound of cheese falls to $3, whilst wine still sells for $7 per gallon, then the relative price of cheese in terms of wine will be less than the opportunity cost. In this case, only wine will be produced. In autarky, that is a situation where there is no international trade, the home country will have to produce both goods for itself. However, for it to do that, the relative price of cheese in terms of the price of wine should adjust equal to its opportunity cost. This is because workers will be willing to work in either sector or industry, since they both maximize their earnings. Therefore, we can conclude that in autarky, the relative price of both goods are equal to the relative unit labor requirement. With the understanding of the relationship between prices and production, we are now in a position to analyze the pattern and effects of trade between two countries based on the assumptions we made earlier. We have used the home country extensively in illustrating the relationship between prices and production. Now let us introduce its trading partner, which we will call foreign. The analysis of the relationship between prices and production we have done for the home country applies to the foreign country. The only difference is that the foreign country, when we refer to it, we will use an asterisk. Otherwise, the way we denote our value, our unit labor or total labor supply is just the same. In the introduction, we briefly talked about the concept of absolute advantage, which exists when one country can produce one unit of a good with fewer labor resources than another country. In our model, absolute advantage occurs when there is a difference between the unit labor requirement of one and that of foreign country in the production of the same good. For example, if we have a situation where the unit labor requirement for cheese is less in the home country as compared to the foreign country, whilst the unit labor requirement of in the production of wine is smaller in the foreign country than the home country, then we can conclude that the home nation has an absolute advantage in the production of cheese, whilst the foreign nation has an absolute advantage in the production of wine. In such a case, the theory of absolute advantage predicts that there will be mutual gains from trade if home specializes in the production of cheese and then export it to the foreign nation in exchange for wine. However, if we have a situation where home is now efficient in the production of both cheese and wine, the home nation will have an absolute advantage in the production of this good, whilst the foreign nation would have an absolute disadvantage in the production of both goods. In such a case, the theory of absolute advantage does not outline how mutual benefits from trade can be achieved. This is the problem that David Ricardo resolved using the concept of comparative advantage. Therefore, absolute advantage on its own cannot be used to explain the patterns of trade. Rather, we use the theory of comparative advantage. In practice, the unit labor requirement can follow any pattern. However, for our model, we will add another assumptions where we assume that the home nation is less productive than the foreign in wine production, but more productive in cheese production. That is, the ratio of unit labor requirement to produce a pound of cheese to that of wine is lower in the home nation than in the foreign nation. In simple terms, we are saying home has a comparative advantage in cheese production. Note that the condition for comparative advantage is different from that of absolute advantage in that for comparative advantage, all the 4 unit labor requirements are necessary. Therefore, when the home country increases cheese production, it reduces wine production less than the foreign country would. Since the slope of the PPC curve indicates the opportunity cost of cheese in terms of wine, the foreign PPC curve will be steeper than that of home. This is because foreign relative labor requirement in cheese is higher than that of the home country, implying that to produce a pound of cheese, the foreign nation must forego more gallons of wine than home. The foreign PPC curve is illustrated in figure 3.2. In Turkey, the relative price of cheese to wine reflects the opportunity cost of cheese in terms of wine in each country. However, once international trade exists, prices will no longer be determined purely by domestic consideration. Based on the assumptions we have made that home has a comparative advantage in cheese production, it will be beneficial for home country to specialize in cheese production and export the excess to foreign nationals in exchange for wine. This trade pattern will not go on indefinitely, as eventually relative prices will equalize. Nevertheless, what is important is to determine the level at which the relative price of cheese to wine settle. That is, how many units of cheese will be exchanged for a gallon of wine in order to evaluate the benefits of trade. In the presence of international trade, the prices of traded products are determined by the interaction between supply and demand. As a result, in our model, we will use a general equilibrium analysis approach of supply and demand to allow for a precise analysis of the linkages between markets. That is to say, we are more interested in the relative supply and relative demand of traded products, not just the quantities supplied nor the quantities demanded. Firstly, let us start by analyzing the relative supply. Relative supply refers to the total quantities of cheese supplied by all countries relative to the quantity of wine supplied by all countries, as outlined by the equation below. Recall that the home nation worker will work in the cheese sector if the relative price of cheese in terms of wine exceed the opportunity cost. More so, they can decide to work in the wine sector if the relative price of cheese in terms of wine is less than its opportunity cost. The same applies to the foreign nation. Furthermore, we have assumed that the home country has a comparative advantage in cheese production. Therefore, 5 scenarios guide the structure of our relative supply curve. The first scenario: if the relative price of cheese falls below the opportunity cost of cheese in both countries, then there will be no cheese production in both countries, as both countries' workers will be better off producing wine, given that wine offers a higher wage. The second scenario: if the relative price of cheese is equal to its opportunity cost in the home country, then home workers will be indifferent in either working in the cheese industry or the wine industry. Thus, both cheese and wine will be produced in the home country, whereas in the foreign country, only wine is being produced, since earnings wine in the foreign wine sector will still be high. Third scenario: If the relative price of cheese is in between the opportunity cost of cheese in both countries, then the workers in the home country will specialize in the production of cheese, whilst those in the foreign country will specialize in wine production. Those workers do so because they are earning higher wages in the industry in which they specialize in, or they specialize their production in. Therefore, the world relative supply of cheese equals the maximum cheese production divided by the maximum wine production. Remember, this maximum cheese production is being produced by the home nation, and the maximum wine production is being produced by the foreign nation. Fourth scenario: if the relative price of cheese equals the opportunity cost in the foreign nation, then foreign workers are indifferent in the production of both goods, since the earnings in both industries are the same. Hence, both goods will be produced in the foreign nation. However, the home nation will still specialize in cheese production, since its cheese industry will still be providing higher wages as compared to the wine industry. Fifth scenario: if the relative price of cheese rises above the opportunity cost of cheese in both countries, then there will be no wine production in both countries. Rather, workers in both countries will only produce cheese, since the cheese industries offer higher wages. From the five scenarios, we can see that the world relative supply has a stepped function or structure. Let us use an example. Suppose the home opportunity cost in terms of wine is equal to half, and that of foreign country is 2. Based on these values, the first step of the world relative supply curve is at point half. This is the point where the home relative price of cheese equals its opportunity cost. Thereafter, it jumps up when the relative price of cheese falls in between the two nations' opportunity cost. Then, lastly, the second step will be at point 2. That is the point where the relative price of cheese equals the foreign opportunity cost. The relative demand for cheese is the quantity of cheese demanded in both countries relative to the quantity of wine demanded in both countries. It reflects the substitution effect, that is, as the price of cheese relative to the price of wine rises, consumers in all countries will tend to purchase less cheese and more wine, so that the relative quantity demanded of cheese falls, thus reflecting a downward sloping relative demand curve. The equilibrium price of cheese is determined by the interaction of relative demand and relative supply, as depicted in figure 3.3. At point 1, the relative price of cheese is between the two countries' opportunity cost. In this case, each nation will specialize in the production of the good in which they have relatively lower unit labor requirement or comparative advantage. Also note that the equilibrium point can occur at any point along the relative supply curve. For example, suppose the equilibrium occurs at point 2, the home relative price of cheese is the same as its opportunity cost. The workers at home will be indifferent between working in the cheese or wine industry. Hence, both goods will be produced in the home country, as shown by point Q prime. Specialization from the efficient use of resources leads to gains or mutual gains from international trade. Domestic workers earn a higher income from cheese production because the relative price of cheese increases with trade. On the other hand, foreign workers earn a higher income from wine production because the relative price of cheese decreases with trade, making cheese cheaper, and the relative price of wine increases with trade. To illustrate these gains from trade, there are two ways one can use. The first way is to think of specialization as an indirect method of production where one nation specialized in the production of one good and then trade with the other nation in order to obtain the other good. This approach is more efficient than the direct production method. More so, this approach leads to the expansion of consumption beyond the production possibilities of a nation. Let us use an example to clarify the indirect method of production. The table below illustrates the unit labor requirement for cheese and wine in a home and in the foreign um, country. The opportunity cost of producing cheese in the home nation is half gallon of wine foregone, whilst that of the foreign country is 2 gallons of wine. On the other hand, the opportunity cost of producing wine in the home nation is 2 pounds of cheese, whilst that of foreign nation is half a pound of cheese. Based on the information on the table, we can see that the home nation has an absolute advantage in the production of both goods since they can produce both goods with fewer resources than foreign workers. However, the home nation has a comparative advantage in the production of cheese, whilst the foreign nation has a comparative advantage in wine production. With trade, the terms of trade or the rate of exchange between cheese and wine will be a value in between the two opportunity costs. As with our example, where the interaction between relative supply and relative demand was at point 1, the price of cheese in terms of wine was assumed to be 1, so that 1 pound of cheese will be traded for 1 gallon of wine. Given the terms of trade of 1, the foreign country can purchase or exchange 1 gallon of wine for 1 pound of cheese, of which before trade they had to forgo 2 gallons of wine to free enough resources to produce 1 pound of cheese. Using the indirect production method, they benefit from specialization and trade. On the other hand, the whole nation can now exchange 1 pound of cheese for 1 gallon of wine, of which they before trade had to forgo 2 pounds of cheese in order to free up enough resources to produce 1 gallon of wine. It is clear from this example that both countries mutually benefit from international trade through specialization. Another way to see the gains from trade is through changes in consumption possibilities of both countries. Looking at figure 3.4, in autarky, consumption and production possibilities are illustrated by the curves PF and PF with asterisks for the home country and the foreign country. However, with trade and complete specialization, production will be at point F and F star in the home and foreign countries respectively, but the consumption possibility changes. The new consumption possibilities are illustrated by the line FT and F star T star curves for home and foreign nation. Thus, complete specialization in trade can thus expand the consumption choices for consumers, and it leaves them better off as compared to the autarky outcomes. Up to now, we have developed a simple model of international trade. Although it is far too simple to explain trends and patterns of trade, the focus on relative productivity is a useful tool of analyzing trade. Although our simple one-factor model has not explicitly compared wages between two trading partners, it is possible to do so. Relative wages are the wages of the home country relative to the wages of the foreign country. The differences in relative wages are as a result of productivity differences. Based on our example, we saw that the relative wage between home and foreign countries settles in between the ratio of how much better home is at making cheese and how much better it is at making wine to foreign as compared to the foreign country. Therefore, relative wages cause home to have a cost advantage in cheese only, whilst foreign nation will also have a cost advantage in the production of wine only. Let us use an example to clarify how the cost advantages occur. With specialization, home workers who work in the cheese industry while those in the foreign country who work in the wine industry. So in the home nation, workers per hour will earn the value of 1 pound of cheese. Recall it takes 1 hour to produce 1 pound of cheese. The workers in the foreign nation will earn the value of a third of a gallon of wine. Recall it takes 3 hours to produce 1 gallon of wine. Suppose a pound of cheese and a gallon of wine both sell for $12. Then, since home workers specialize in cheese production, they will earn $12 per hour, whilst those in the foreign nation will earn $4 from the production of wine per hour. Therefore, the relative wages between the two countries will be equal to $3. From the example, we see that the relative wage of $3 lies between the ratio of the productivities in each industry. That is, the home country is 6 times as productive in cheese production, but only 1.5 times as productive in wine production. This reflects that the home country has a wage 3 times higher than the foreign country. It is because the relative wage falls in between the two countries' productivities that each country ends up with a cost advantage in production. That is, foreign workers have a wage that is only a third the wage of domestic workers. They are able to attain a cost advantage in wine production despite low productivity, whereas domestic workers have a productivity that is 6 times that of foreign workers in cheese production. They are able to attain a cost advantage in cheese production despite high wages. A numeric example of our one-factor model is assume that relative wages of home and foreign country reflect their productivity, and that ratio will give each country a cost advantage in one of the traded products. Does this really happen empirically? Empirical evidence shows that the natural wage rate do indeed reflect differences in productivity. That is, low wages are associated with low productivity. More so, empirical evidence shows that wages tend to rise as productivity rises. Most of the times, people utter comments that seem plausible about international trade, but these comments are not factually correct. Our simple model of comparative advantage helps to illustrate why these comments are incorrect, based on the three most persistent comments that people make. The first one is that free trade is beneficial only if you are strong enough to stand up to foreign competition. However, this is incorrect, as benefits of trade do not depend on absolute advantage but comparative advantage. The second one is known as the pauper labor argument. Free trade with countries that pay low wages hurt high wage countries. This argument overlooks the benefit from trade on consumers and other workers. Since workers earn a higher wage in the industry they specialize their production in, and also consumers can purchase more goods at a cheaper price given that they are engaging in international trade. The third one is that free trade exploits less productive countries whose workers make low wages. This is also not true because exploitation of workers can happen with or without trade, and the denial of less productive countries to engage in international trade where they specialize in the production of goods that they do have the lowest opportunity cost or a comparative advantage will even hurt them more. So allowing them to trade would also be acting on um, poverty levels, improving the poverty levels within these countries, as well as the standards of living of the people who live in that particular country. So trade is actually beneficial to these low wage countries. The simple one factor model of international trade can be extended to include many products. To achieve that, let's further assume that both home and foreign countries consume a large number of goods and services, say N, and the technology in home and foreign country are best described by the unit labor requirement. More so, we attach a number to each good for ease of ordering opportunity cost from the lowest to the highest. As with the one factor model, with two goods, products will be produced where they are cheapest to produce or where the opportunity cost of production is the lowest. To determine who produce which good amongst the two nations, we need to know the ratio of home to foreign wages. Let W denote the wage rate. Then the wage payments will be equal to the wage rate multiplied by the unit labor requirement. Therefore, if home total wage payment is less than foreign, then the good in question will be produced in the home nation. Alternatively, when the relative productivity of a country in producing a good is higher than the relative wage, then the good will be produced in that country. Suppose there are five goods, namely apples, bananas, caviar, dates, and enchiladas, produced in the world. Data on the unit labor requirement and the relative home productivity is illustrated in the table below. With specialization, there exists a cutoff line against the ordered goods which is determined by the ratio of the two countries' wages. If the ratio of the two countries' wages is, let's say, $3 for argument's sake, then the home country will produce apples, bananas, and caviar, whilst the foreign nation will produce dates and enchiladas. Note that if the ratio of the wages is equal to the ratio of unit labor requirement, then a borderline case occurs which can be produced by both nations. However, in the normal case, if each country specializes and trade the excess products for other goods, that is, the goods they need, then each country benefit from trade. Nevertheless, if a country tries to produce all the goods for itself, then this country would waste resources. Therefore, with specialization, the home country has high productivity in apples, bananas, and caviars than that give it a cost advantage despite its high wage, whilst the foreign country has low wage that give it a cost advantage despite its low productivity in dates and enchiladas. In our analysis of the factor model with many goods, we assume that the relative wage of 3 but now, how did that relative wage of 3 get determined? Recall for our one-factor model with two goods, we determine the relative wage by first calculating home wages in terms of cheese and foreign wages in terms of wine, and then use the price of cheese relative to that of wine to deduce the ratio of the two countries' wage rate. This was done because we knew home had a comparative advantage in cheese, but in the case of many goods, we cannot do that. Rather, we use the relative supply and relative derived demand from labor to deduce the wage rate. Relative derived demand is not direct demand, but it is derived from the results of demand for goods and services within each country. The relative derived demand for home labor falls when the relative wage rate falls for two reasons. Firstly, goods produced in the home country becomes more expensive and the world demand for these goods falls. Secondly, home wages rises, leading to fewer goods being produced in the home country. The two reasons why relative demand falls as the relative wage rate rises can be illustrated using an example. Suppose the relative wage rate rises from 3 to 3.9. The pattern of trade will not change as the home country will produce apples, bananas, and caviar, whilst the foreign nation will produce dates and enchiladas. However, if the relative wage rises to 4.01, then there will be a change in the pattern of trade as caviar becomes expensive to produce in the home country and cheaper to produce in the foreign country. Figure 3.5 illustrates the determination of relative wages. The relative wages is determined by the interaction of the relative supply and the derived relative demand for labor. Assuming the number of person hours available does not change with the wage rate, the relative wage will not have any effect on labor supply. This is the reason why the relative labor supply curve is a vertical straight line. The stepped shape of the relative demand curve is explained by the derived relative demand for the goods in question. Figure 3.5 shows that the equilibrium relative wage is $3. The movement of the relative wage from $3 to $3.95 does not change the pattern of trade. The same is true for any movement along the downward sloping path. However, if the movement crosses a step, then the pattern of trade changes. If the relative wage falls to 4, then a borderline case occurs, resulting in both countries producing the specific product. The one-factor model with many goods allows us to take our model one step further to analyze the effects of transport cost. In general, transport cost does not change the fundamental principles of comparative advantage. However, they add barriers to the free movement of goods and services between countries. According to the Ricardian model, one would expect efficient use of production resources through specialization in trade, but this is not the case with some products due to these three main reasons. Firstly, more than one factor of production reduces the tendency of specialization. Two, protectionism in domestic industries. Three, transportation costs reduce or prevent trade, which may cause each country to produce the same goods or service. The introduction of transport costs renders certain products non-tradable, since the transport costs increase production costs to the extent that it becomes cheaper to produce the good by ourselves, even though we have a comparative disadvantage in the production of the good. In practice, there are several transport costs. Therefore, with transport cost and a weak national cost advantage, many products that could have been traded will become non-tradable goods. One important observation is that most nations spend a large share of their income on non-traded products. The Ricardian model is a simple model of trade that has extremely useful tools one can use in analyzing the pattern of trade, as well as the effects of trade on national welfare. The model is a good fit to the real-world trade pattern. However, it does have its misleading prediction. For example, in the case of non-traded goods, we do not see extreme specialization, or in the case of income distribution, the Ricardian model does not consider income distribution, but it assumes the whole country benefits from trade, which might not be the case. And then in the case of factors of production, the Ricardian model does not account for other factors of production none other than labor. However, in spite of these findings, the basic prediction of the Ricardian model that productivity differences plays an important role in international trade and comparative advantage matters for trade are well supported by empirical evidence.